Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm joined today by Dwayne Matthews, who's the founder and CEO of TomorrowNow Learning Labs. Really interesting guy that has a lot of keynotes and content that you can find on LinkedIn. We'll include links to all that in the show notes. Dwayne, welcome to Trending in Education.
Mike, thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you. Truth be told, we met on the shoot of another podcast, Ed Heads, featuring AJ Gutierrez. Really interesting podcast. You had a great conversation over there. You have an interesting story. I want our listeners to get caught up on it. Can you catch us up on how you got to this point in your professional life?
Sure. So I started teaching grades 3, 4, 5, 6, and a little bit of library. I started my career at what is called an inner city school, a school by the name of Heron Park.
Mm.
School's now gone. They cleared the school and built a new subdivision. And I don't know if that was coincidence or not. I spent a little bit of time in Peru. I spent 2 years living in Peru, where I taught at a school that was completely different. It was an extremely affluent and future forward looking independent private school, international private school.
Mhm.
And there, while I was living in Peru, I had an experience heading to the jungle. So no ayahuasca or anything that interesting, but I had an experience where I was going through a town and I went through this town and I had a conversation with some of the people around mining. And I decided at that moment that I was going to switch out of teaching and go into technology transfer and technology scouting. So I
Mm.
started a little company doing that, but had an opportunity to exit that company. Nothing super exciting. There's nothing Italian parked in the driveway, but we did okay.
Yeah.
And from there, I started to realize that, what we were doing was looking for any kind of technology, person, or paradigm that would be shifted
Mm.
because of innovations.
Yeah.
And I started to realize education did not have a clear line of sight on this. And I realized that if we're preparing students to go into this future world, this economic life, and that economic life was going through major transitions, that we needed to have some kind of eyesight on that. And so that's when I came and I created TomorrowNow Learning Lab. And a lot of the work that I do, I blended in a few different things together, open innovation and education and
Mhm.
technology, and put
Yeah.
it all together.
And you're also keynoting and doing workshops and advising. So in some ways, you're living your best life, some might say.
100%. You know what? I started down this path and, when I was in high school, my guidance counselor said that you're going to be a teacher, a speaker, or a preacher. So I've not been a preacher, but I've definitely
Yeah.
been.
There's
So
still time. There's still time. You
yeah,
could always blend it all in. You never know.
it would make my late grandmother very happy.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's an interesting time to be doing what you're doing. And you've been out there on your own to a large extent. How long have you been out on your own? And it's been a very interesting run, the last 4+ years now. But how does that intersect with you and Tomorrow Now Learning Labs and the work that you've been doing?
Sure. So, I exited the first company probably around 2013, 2014, had a failure in between. And then in 2016, really focused in on what I wanted to do. And interestingly enough, Tomorrow Now Learning Lab started conceptually in 2002. I started writing journals about what the future of education would look like when I was teaching.
Yeah.
And I had a huge stack of journals. And when the pandemic hit in
Mm.
2020,
Mhm.
pulled my stack of journals out and I looked at my 10-year-old son and I said, "Hey, let's start something called Tomorrow Now Learning Labs together." So he's actually a co-founder
Nice.
uh, on Tomorrow Now Learning Labs. And what we did is we looked at what were all the technologies that we could put our hands on, what were all of the cool techniques and processes that we could put our hands on. Could we design something? And so we started designing something like I rented space. This 2020,
Yeah.
when nobody was renting anything.
Yeah.
We drove down the road by ourselves. We rented space. We had VR headsets and we connected with people from all over the world. And we sort of built out this process and it sort of evolved into, wow, that was pretty cool. I had a chance to speak to the prime minister and a bunch of other people about what we did. And
Yeah.
it evolved from there. So I spent most of my days, I would say 80%, doing keynotes,
Mhm.
workshops, and advisory on a lot of the things that I learned during that process, but also a lot of the things that I learned from the open innovation technology transfer process that I
Yeah.
was doing before.
Right.
which it's not really prevalent in education. So I spent
I
my
see.
time really connecting education to the future work.
That's really interesting. That is a theme and a topic that comes up a lot on this podcast over the years. And in particular, what you're talking about really in two ways. One, we do talk a lot about learning transfer for the individual, where when you shift jobs or shift paradigms yourself, how ultimately, best case, you're able to transfer learnings from the previous context and then bring new insights to the new one. So that's one dimension to it. And then the other is we're always looking for insight from adjacencies and think about how, one of the main ones I gravitate to is media and entertainment and what trends we're seeing around media and entertainment. How are they relevant to the world of education? But then you're talking more hardcore tech innovations, including artificial intelligence, which, we made it this far without bringing up AI, but it is time, Dwayne. I know you've thought a lot about that. You've actually looked at the history of technology and the history of those types of innovations. What are some of your thoughts on, this moment in time and how the world of education is being transformed by this new educational technology, which AI in many ways is?
So, one of the things that I say to people is that education, scalable, compulsory education has always been about technology. It's always been about technology. I've said this before, but the technology was a 600-year-old technology called a printed book. We created a strategy around that technology, and that strategy is called school. And then we made it compulsory. In 1863, we had the Emancipation Proclamation in most of the Western world. And by 1871, we decided that compulsory education would replace, the enslaved in terms of powering the economy. And that's had a profound impact. Now, no one is alive when we thought about that strategic beginning. So we've made these incremental improvements for the last 200 years or so. And now we have a number of converging technologies that beg the question, how do we strategically create a new opportunity? And what does that opportunity look like in terms of our economic life?
Mhm.
Now, if we go back to 1871 and we look at all of the human progress indicators, every single human progress indicator between 1801 and 1900 goes like this.
Yeah.
It's this J curve. And from 1945, we become significantly more peaceful. The water rises for more people. It's not perfect, but it rises for more people. And we did that with a really small percentage of efficiency in terms of education.
Yeah.
I think we have a profound opportunity now. But one thing I'd like to say before I stop is you talked about media and entertainment. And I think, that was the canary in the coal mine to let us know how technology was going to transform learning.
Mm.
When I was a young boy, there weren't very many people that could break dance. I could. There
Yeah.
weren't people that could do a lot of art.
Right.
But with YouTube, with video, with social media platforms, we see an absolute explosion
Mm.
of, of these things around the world. They don't fit inside the
Yeah.
formal education box, but in terms of learning, it's massive.
Yeah,
It's
informal education powered by YouTube and social media, TikTok, which is also very much in the news now, as far as, what's actually gonna happen in the US around that, and also the impact of these technologies. I'm in the middle of The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, talking about Gen Z and how Gen Z was impacted by a lot of these social media when they first rolled out and they were kind of unchecked. That's another element to this, Dwayne, too. Like if we pass that point of inflection, we're getting closer to the singularity and stuff's changing really fast. How do we stay ahead of it? How do we make sure it's safe? There's a lot of risk aversion and loss aversion in the framing where like what's at stake. There's a lot of upside to your point. But how should we think about risk and how should we think about managing against the darker scenarios, the Black Mirror scenarios that we're kind of living in nowadays?
sure. So one of the things that I find is, when I lived in Peru, the driving used to terrify me, right? It was absolutely terrifying. But I always found that when I flew in on a plane and I looked down, it didn't look as terrifying. everything moves a little bit more slowly and I could see the whole picture. So the first thing that I would say is we need to go up to an eagle's eye view
Mm.
when we're looking at the scenario. Right now, we judge it from, AI detectors, the kids are cheating.
Yeah.
No, no. Come up and say, what are we actually looking at? So that would
I
be,
like the eagle's eye view. I was also thinking maybe a condor if we're in the Andes. I don't know. I'm
you
just spitballing here. Yeah.
well, yeah, out here, we got a lot of hawks where I am. And
Yeah. Yeah. A raptor of some kind, like a tough bird who gets up there and has some keen eyesight. Maybe even an owl.
well, I don't know about the owls if they're up there, but these birds, like,
Oh, you're talking about up high. Yeah.
it can just be very calm and then dive down and grab like a mouse
Yeah.
or a dove out of a tree. I find that fascinating. But so I think that's thing number one. And then I think the second idea is to look and think about the frameworks themselves about what's happening in terms of innovation. So here's what happens in innovation. When we have a disruptive technology, we get a wow. Chat GPT in November. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. Today, people,
Yeah.
well, it didn't get it perfect. So that disruptive technology starts to look for a disruptive model.
Hmm.
And so the disruptive model is really a technology roll up,
Mm.
right? A know how roll up. What can we put in a crucible, mix it all together to come out with something? And how do we know when it's thriving, when
Yeah.
it's going to thrive? Well,
Mhm.
here's how we know. Digital innovative models, they create a balanced equation. The balanced equation is cognitive physical surplus plus productivity equals transition plus growth.
Mm.
Understanding that is really important because then we can find a risk.
I feel like we need a whiteboard for this, but I'll try to remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So the risk
Yeah.
is the cognitive physical surplus
Yeah.
transition. Let me give you a practical example of what I mean. We have a disruptive technology in compulsory education, the book,
Hmm.
right? The book stops us from moving around on the farm.
Hmm.
We're farmers before, 98% of us
Mm.
sitting for 6 hours. What's the risk? You and I are sitting right now, increasing the risk of heart disease. The number one killer in the world is not war. It's not racism. It's
Mm.
not climate change. It's heart disease.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say sitting on your ass, but yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, pretty much the correlation is there. Diabetes as well. The
Hmm.
correlation is there, right? The other risk factor is transition. If you didn't learn how to read and write,
Mm. Hmm.
world leaves you behind,
Yeah.
right? And so those two pieces were the risk factors that we had to account for.
Yeah.
Today,
Yeah. Trade off.
what, what's the cognitive surplus? What do we do with it? We talked about social media. Well, when I have extra cognitive surplus, I can pick up the channel
Hmm.
and I can figure out what do I use my cognitive surplus for if I'm aware,
Yeah.
or if I'm not aware, somebody else has a plan for it,
Yeah.
right? They grab it in the
Yeah.
form of commoditize it and
Hmm.
sell it in the form
Yeah.
of data. And I do that for free if I'm not paying attention.
Yeah.
Same thing with transition. Well, what happens to my job? Is AI going to take my job? So I think the way that we tame it is we say, look, there's going to be cool stuff and we can look at that. The model is what we're looking out for and planning for the cognitive physical surplus,
Mm.
the transition, having a strategy and a plan for those
Hmm.
will allow us to navigate the space pretty positively. If
Hmm.
not, if not, we get caught flat footed. And that's when we feel a high level of anxiety, as you
Hmm.
referenced, the anxiety generation. And one thing I'll say about that is if you look back when we had transitions in the past, you'll find the same level of anxiety,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
After 1918, you had the roaring 20s,
Hmm.
and right around what, 1929, 1930,
Yep.
lots of anxiety, war, people losing their jobs.
Yep.
It sounds very similar if you read accounts. It sounds very similar to now with
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, I've been connecting it to the 70s as well, the 60s into the 70s. Alvin Toffler's book Future Shock. It's relevant today where I think where, you go through these periods of equilibrium and then shock to the system and it changes. And the crazy part lately is there's been multiple shocks and there is the idea, this is perhaps the acceleration of things, but the world just may be more VUCA moving forward, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, like that is perhaps the new reality, which requires a new set of skills, a new set of competencies, which we both need to learn and then also articulate and train others in. First and foremost is, AI literacy. Arguably, media literacy is as critical, both in terms of understanding just misinformation, but also understanding how to have your own voice and kind of get your own message out there. You're someone who's thinking about all this, and then you also are developing your own thought leadership platform. Thoughts on like the skills for this new economy? And skills mindsets is the other thing that's interesting too. Even skills have shorter and shorter shelf lives, but then the mindset and sort of your underlying framework, the ways in which you engage with the world, hopefully there's a little more resilience there. Thoughts on your end around, kind of the new complement of skills?
Sure. So I think one of the biggest pieces is going to be, what do you do with your cognitive surplus, right? How do you use that cognitive surplus? And how do you start thinking about self actualization at scale?
Mm,
It's not something that we've ever had to deal with,
yeah.
right? We have the premise of our entire economic life that's based on absolutely everything is scarce,
Scarcity. Yep.
right? So we manage scarcity. Economy is based on, two Greek words, and then eventually a French word that really is around the concept is managing your house, managing the scarce resources around your house.
Yeah. Cultivating your garden if you're into Voltaire,
There you go, right? But here's the difference. In 1871, we talk about compulsory education. Here in Ontario, we have it for the first time. And I can imagine walking to a farmer and saying, I want to take 6 of your children that are working on the farm all day, that are physically extremely strong. I'm going to put them in a small schoolhouse for 6 hours,
yeah.
and the entire world is going to have more food than we know what to do with. We'll
Right.
all be obese. It's going to be a much more abundant world.
Right.
And your kids are going to be physically weaker. What do you think about that?
Hmm.
I can imagine that farmer thinking, you got to be out of your mind,
Right.
right? For thousands of years before that, the paradigm was farming,
Hmm.
right? And farming has a whole way of thinking about it in terms of country, in terms of wars, in terms of violence. All of those things are based on the agricultural economic life.
Yeah.
And post that, we have this really crazy idea. Guess what? Half of the people are going to work in buildings,
Yeah.
and they're just going to move electrical impulses back and
Yeah.
forth.
I mean, and even in between, there's the industrial model too, right? Where the workforce is being trained. Arguably, our current institution of school is perhaps set up for factory life.
Nation building is the primary model is based on a Prussian model that was designed for nation building. So some people going into professional spaces and some people going into workspaces.
Yeah.
Essentially, a 30-40 mix
Hmm.
was
And
was
the military. Yeah. Hmm.
right, was the thought process. However, we're moving on to a new S-curve economic life, which creates an event horizon.
Mm,
Really hard for us to see what's coming next. So all of the conversation is, how do we substitute this new paradigm shifting technology into the paradigm that we have? So we
right.
just want to substitute it and
Hmm.
make some modifications
Hmm.
and go on about our life.
Hmm.
We're starting to realize a really uncomfortable truth, which is we have a new paradigm coming. We're going from that farming market to
Yeah.
that industrial world. So now what I believe is coming is this idea of abundance and cognitive surplus that's dramatically more.
Hmm.
A lot of the work that I think that we're going to be doing is really digital input into the overall system, which we should get compensated for, right? Like
Right.
right now, we're not compensated.
Right.
There's a huge movement the last 2 weeks on open sourcing. So Meta's come out and they're open sourcing,
Mm,
and a bunch of others have come out and they're open sourcing. But that open sourcing is really about, give me permission to capture your data so
exactly.
I can get around the lawsuits. But I would go a bit further. I would say, no, I think it's time for you to start paying me for contributing. I need a new social contract.
Right.
If AI is going to take a vast majority of the knowledge work, and 50 to 60% of our work right now is knowledge. Instead of worrying about the jobs, I'm more concerned about what's the new economic model? How do we thrive?
Right. As opposed to the darker scenario that's out there is the Wally or the idiocracy scenario, right? Where that cognitive surplus is immediately absorbed into low value, the equivalent of non-nutritious food. We spend our time, slurping up our smoothies and watching inane television or inane social media in this case. And that is the real existential risk. How do we guard against that? How do we check the commercial interests and the risk that, the for-profit advertising model that kind of underpins a lot of our society winds up eating up a lot of that cognitive surplus rather than applying it either to a new generative era, a new golden age of sorts.
Well, because it can't. It needs something to feed on, right?
Mm,
If I don't have economic credits to change, there's nothing to advertise for.
right,
If I have a generative AI and I combine that with, let's say, 3D printing, then, what am I buying? What am I buying if I can make everything at home
right,
that I need, right?
right.
If I don't have a job, if enough of us don't have a job,
Yeah,
then who's shopping?
right.
So what's the advertising?
Yeah.
So if we follow it through from an eagle's eye view,
Hmm.
realize that either A, it doesn't continue to the Black Mirror model because it won't be able to sustain itself, or B, there's something new that has to come around. And here's what's interesting. The two things that are interesting. A, when we have these new innovations, we typically have this fear because that's who we've evolved to be. Like if
Yeah.
there's something moving in the bushes,
Hmm.
our ancestors weren't rewarded for going to look and
No, the ones that got here
explore,
didn't spend
right?
a lot of
It
time in it.
ran away.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a crazy story. So I was at this party, and at this party was Justin Bieber, and down on the back, somebody had a tiger in the backyard. And they said, Dwayne, do you want to go pet the tiger? And I said, no. And I stood just a little bit further back. And they said, but you're still standing here. And I said, I know, because I'm 100% sure I can run faster than at least those 10 people. We'll all make it out of here.
Right. And
Just
you don't want to miss the spectacle. You need to kind of play with your
right.
head up ideally, you
Justin
know?
Bieber got into a lot of trouble. It was very unfair how they treated him. But the point being is that, if our collective imagination, well, let me back up. We saw a story from 1924, and the story was looking at how do you believe the world would be in 100 years? And so we're going through all of these things, my wife, my son, and I, and I'm realizing they were right about
Mm,
so many things.
yeah.
And I said, wow, they were right. This is amazing. And my son flippantly says, yeah, well, that's because that's their collective imagination then. And he walked
Mm,
away. Well,
mm,
that's vision.
yeah.
So we have two visions, the Matrix,
Yeah.
Star Trek Next Generation,
There
right?
you go.
And so those collective visions will determine how we move forward.
Right.
One of those visions has more weight will determine. If you look at societies of the past, the collective vision has always determined where it goes. The
Yeah.
ancient Egyptians were very into the afterlife. They built pyramids
Mm,
with a lot of focus. Groups of there's certain groups of people that were on continents that were very close. So they envisioned war.
yeah.
And so that's the history that they built.
Mm,
As we start looking forward now, I think we all collectively realize, we're not 100% convinced that selling our attention for free,
yeah.
or I shouldn't even say selling, having our attention harnessed for free is the best way for us to proceed. It's not the best way for us to raise our kids.
Yeah.
It's, I think the vast majority of society is at that place right now. And I don't think it gets worse. I think it gets better because I think
Mm,
we saying, well, what do we do? So I see that my son and his friends, they started turning off their notifications when they do homework.
yeah.
And that's self-forming. I don't force that, right? He
Right.
plugged on in, not in his bedroom. I don't enforce that. So I think we'll get to a place where we start thinking, okay, we're a little bit over the shock and awe. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, that's really crazy. Oh my gosh, it's really scary.
Yeah.
And we're thinking, what do we actually want to do? What's the opportunity? How do we mitigate the risk,
Yeah.
the actual upside to this?
Right. Yeah, it reminds me two things. One is obviously the Gartner hype cycle. Everything is the Gartner hype cycle. So we got to go through the trough of disillusionment. And then on the other side, the stuff will start to emerge. Actually, like some of the older forms of artificial intelligence, like predictive analytics and, machine learning, they're actually mature already. They're reaching that slope of enlightenment, which is why we're actually in this new phase of AI. The generative piece is more the one that just kind of shook us and also shook knowledge workers in a way that perhaps we weren't ready to accept. The other notion that it reminds me of, though, as you're talking about this cognitive surplus, you've talked a lot about stranded brilliance, which is, that language has stuck with me since I first heard you talking about it. Can you bring that into the conversation and how that relates to this new era we're living in?
Sure. So at the very beginning of, if you look at economic output, the economic output on the planet from, zero to 1870 is pretty much flat. We create compulsory education, and within the next 20 to 30 years, the economic output goes like this.
Mm,
IQ goes like this.
mm,
Life expectancy goes like this. So many things go up. And that happens because we unlock stranded brilliance. There was brilliance locked. There were a handful of people making decisions before.
mm,
Only 12% of the population could read in 1820.
right.
Now it's around 90% in most of, the quote unquote industrialized worlds. And so unlocking that stranded brilliance had a massive impact on everything. And if we measure that stranded brilliance as an indicator, we use post-secondary education entrance, we're probably between 30 to 50% efficiency, depending on the country,
Mm,
right? So it's about 30% to 50% of most of the industrialized world that has a post-secondary certificate, diploma,
yep.
what have you.
Mhm,
If we now have the ability to unlock more of the stranded drawings, the argument, I believe, is that we will have more opportunity to solve more problems. We will be able to see things from different angles, right? Somebody said to me, Dwayne, I don't think this, where's this education revolution that you're talking about? Like, I don't see it happening. And I said, well, where have you looked?
mm,
He said, well, teachers in North America aren't using AI. I said, well, there are a million people on an AI platform in India. There are 500,000 students that are being onboarded to their student learning system with an AI platform, AI component in the background of the platform.
yeah,
And every single textbook will have to have an AI companion by 2025. I would say it really depends on where you look.
yeah.
And so that unlocks a massive amount of stranded brilliance. The CEO of Microsoft said that, he's going to train 2 million people on AI for free in
Mm,
India.
mhm,
Give you some context. Canada has 2 million students altogether,
yeah.
right? So that's like every single student that we had being trained for free on this AI technology from their cultural perspectives, their
Yeah.
geographic perspectives. There are lots of things that we just can't see from our perspective that they're going to be able to see. There are lots of solutions that they've already figured out that we know nothing about. And all of those things get put into the mix.
Yeah.
Into the pot. We typically have about a 99% good to bad ratio on planet Earth.
Mm, yeah.
So I'm wary of the challenges, but I'm radically optimistic about the possibilities.
Yeah. It is interesting circling back to what you were talking about around YouTube as well and how informal education has really taken off while post-secondary education, particularly in the US, I imagine in Canada, is really being more looked at critically perhaps than it ever has been in the past. Also, the question of relevance and job readiness. Are you most likely to get that through the traditional instruments of K-12 education and higher education, or is something new really needed? I imagine in part that's why you founded Tomorrow Now Learning Labs, is to start experimenting. It does remind me of the William Gibson quote, "The future is here now. It's just not very evenly distributed." How do we start to even out that distribution? And are some of these technologies, I always like to think of them as either gap narrowing or gap widening. How do we ensure that they are pointed in the right direction there so that it's not about further separating the elite from the underclass and instead really tapping into the promise of this stuff for everyone.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think, just even in terms of digital divide, like very practical, there's approximately 150 million cell phones that are thrown away in the US every 18 months.
Mhm,
I imagine maybe not as much, but probably in the hundreds of millions as well in terms of laptops.
mhm.
In the UK alone, there are 20 million devices, potential connected devices
Yeah,
that are not being reused, that can be reused. So, I mean, right off the bat, I'm probably at about 200 million already, right? So, in terms of, here'd be an interesting idea. What if we leveraged AI to work out the redistribution of all of this stranded brilliance in terms of devices? And somebody says, well, why would anybody do that? I said, well, you know, if you calculate, let's say 0.17 grams of gold in a cell phone, you're probably looking at about 300 million thereabout dollars in urban mining that's
yeah,
sitting for somebody to figure out, how do I go get $300 million taking garbage off of people's hands?
yeah.
So is there a business model for that? I think so.
Mhm.
Uh, I think it's a solid business model. There's a really cool technology that I saw probably about maybe 15 years ago that can extract gold out of phones in Japan.
Yeah,
And so is it crazy for one of those venture capital guys to say, guess what? I'm going to put together a whole cycle where I'm going to get devices, laptops to kids,
yeah,
and I'm going to get 2-year old to 3-year old devices to kids. I'm going to harness the gold in cell phones and I'm going to turn that into money like Rumpelstiltskin and become the Robin Hood by giving away all those. Is there a significant business model to do that? I think so. And
mhm.
that's just one example,
Yeah,
thinking about different elements from different places around the world. You see lots of poor people in certain countries pulling phones apart to pull apart the gold. I'm like,
yeah,
wow, that's here. We see in Japan, there's actually technology to be able to do it. And you see in the Western world, there's actually feedstock for this stuff. Once we start thinking creatively around those things, we'll figure it out. But I think once we start thinking elite versus not elite, we'll run into challenges. If we start thinking from an elite perspective, wow, if we make more people have more money, we'll be able to sell them more stuff.
yeah,
Then that gets interesting because there's
yeah,
a model to it. If we think unlocking stranded brilliance helps to solve global challenges, then from an altruistic social justice perspective, we get more interesting.
yeah,
And now we start talking in the same language as opposed to, I see you over there and I
mm,
think you're, and I see you over there and I think
yeah,
you're, I think if we bring it a little bit more to the middle,
mm,
center right, center left, we'll be able to find lots of options. So I think the next order of business is to think about how do we start getting people having conversations a little bit more to the middle, center right, center left.
yeah,
So some of these things out because we have a lot of really cool opportunities ahead of us.
yeah. I love that. The design principles, there's a lot of dark patterns in the social media platforms that are out there today. And we're now confronted with the next wave. And did we learn anything from some of the pitfalls and minefields that we just walked into with social media? And is there enough time and enough forethought and enough creative energy, positive forecasting? You write the story of our future together. How do we get the right people, really all of us, thinking through the right frames of reference? As we wrap up here, Dwayne, first off, I'd love to have you back on. We clearly could keep going, but as we wrap up here, any takeaways for folks? Any quick hits for them as they head back to the rest of their lives?
So I would say, just on the last point, and I've said it a few times, and so I'll say this: having a plan for cognitive and physical surplus, having a strategy and a plan is absolutely critical. If people never spoke to me again, I would say make sure that you have a strategy for that. When we talked about social media and the problems related to social media is them harnessing our cognitive surplus in the form of attention and reselling it. We have no plan for our
Mm,
students and for
mm,
ourselves,
mhm.
and so got caught up in that itself, right? They
Yeah.
they use very cool neurological techniques, algorithmic nudging and playing,
Dopamine's a hell of a drug, Dwayne.
right? It's locked into our motivation. That would be one. Number two would be focus on unlocking stranded brilliance, not from an altruistic perspective, but from an interdependent perspective. In terms of challenges, we're able to come up with more solutions when we do that. In terms of capitalism, we're able to generate more business opportunities when we do that.
Mm.
And in terms of the right thing to do, it is the right thing to do. So I would think of those two things, the two things that I would leave people. And, I would be really interested to come back on. I enjoyed the conversation with you. Thank you very much for having me.
Amazing stuff here with Dwayne Matthews. We'll include links to his information. Follow him on LinkedIn. Check out the links in the show notes for this episode if you want to understand more of what Dwayne's got going on. And with that, we'll wrap this episode up. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, write us a review, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.